Back in May 2024, I made 3 predictions. And I made those predictions at a time when nobody believed me, when people laughed at me, when even my own students looked at me like I had completely lost my mind. My first prediction was that Donald Trump would win the 2024 election. My second prediction was that once Donald Trump returned to power, he would begin a war with Iran. And my third prediction, the one that shocked people the most, was that the United States would lose that war. And through that defeat, the world itself would be permanently transformed. Now it's 2026. Trump won, the war began, and people are finally starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the third prediction is becoming reality as well. So today I don't want to focus on the past. I'm not interested in saying I told you so. That part is meaningless. What actually matters, what I think you truly need to understand, is what happens next. Because here's the important thing, I did not make those predictions through luck. I did not guess. I did not toss a coin or read signs in the sky. I made those predictions because I understand the mechanics of history. I understand patterns. I understand game theory. And those exact same patterns, those same structural forces, are now pointing very clearly toward what comes next. So today I want to share my next predictions with you, and more importantly, explain exactly why I believe they are going to happen. Not as prophecy, not as entertainment, but as a serious structural analysis rooted in history and game theory. But before I explain the next predictions, I need to show you why the first 3 were correct. Because if you fail to understand why those predictions came true, then you will never understand why the next ones are likely to come true as well. So think about this carefully. Why did I know Trump would go to war with Iran? The simple answer is this: America had no choice. Now, when people hear that, they immediately say, what do you mean America had no choice? America is the most powerful nation on earth. America has the strongest military. America can do whatever it wants. But that way of thinking is exactly the mistake. Let me explain it with an analogy. Imagine a drug addict. A drug addict only has one real objective, and that objective is getting the next fix. Not because they want to, not because they freely choose to, but because the moment they stop, their entire system begins collapsing. Their body fails. They stop functioning. America is addicted to something as well. And that thing is called the petrodollar. Here's how the system works. Since 1973, global oil has been traded in US dollars. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, every country selling oil. If you wanted to buy that oil, you needed dollars. That forced the entire world to hold dollars. And because the world held dollars, the world also had to purchase American debt and US Treasury bonds. That system became the financial engine of the American empire. It is how America funds its military, its government, and its standard of living. The entire structure is essentially one massive Ponzi scheme held together by oil being traded in dollars. Then in February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. Why was that moment so important? Because after the invasion, something happened that had never happened before. Russia, Iran, and China, 3 major powers, began moving much closer together. They started trading in currencies outside the dollar system. They began creating a Eurasian trade network that did not rely on American shipping, American banks, or American approval. And that became the true existential threat to the United States. Not because Russia, Iran, and China planned to invade America, but because if the world stopped needing dollars, the American financial system itself could collapse almost overnight. The Ponzi scheme would end, and America would no longer be able to sustain its empire. So America had to respond. It had to break apart that alliance. And within that alliance, the weakest and most exposed member was Iran. Iran was already under sanctions. Iran was already economically isolated. And Iran also controlled the Strait of Hormuz, the single most important choke point in the global energy system. If America could remove Iran from the equation, it could cut China off from Middle Eastern energy supplies. It could restore the dominance of the petrodollar. It could keep the empire alive. That is the real reason this war began. Not because Trump is insane, not because Netanyahu pressured him. Those are surface-level details. The deeper structural reality is that the American empire believed it had no alternative. The addict needed another fix. Okay, does that make sense? Good. Now let's talk about the strategy of attrition. So why did I know America would lose this war? Let me explain something important about how wars actually work, because most people completely misunderstand them. Most people think war is about who has the larger army, the better weapons, the most aircraft, or the deepest pockets. But that is not how wars are truly decided. Let me give you another analogy. Imagine a fight at school. There's a bully, the biggest kid in the building. He's strong, surrounded by friends, feared by everyone, and known for being dangerous. Then one day a new student arrives. Smaller kid. Doesn't seem intimidating at all. The bully decides to put him in his place. Now, who wins that fight? Most people instantly say the bully wins because he's bigger, tougher, and more experienced. But what most people fail to notice is this: the bully has something to lose. He has a reputation. If the fight doesn't go perfectly, if the new kid lands even a few punches, if the fight drags on too long, if the bully starts getting exhausted, then suddenly the bully no longer looks invincible. His reputation weakens, and his entire power inside the school depends on that reputation. The new kid, meanwhile, has nothing to lose. Every punch he lands feels like a victory. Every extra day he survives becomes a victory. The longer the fight continues, the worse it looks for the bully and the stronger the new kid appears. That is exactly the dynamic between America and Iran. America entered this conflict expecting Iran to collapse immediately. They expected shock and awe, overwhelming bombing campaigns, the destruction of leadership, and then unconditional surrender within 2 or 3 weeks. That was the plan. In fact, it was the only plan they ever had. And that strategy failed on the very first day because Iran did not collapse. Iran did not surrender. Iran fought back. Iran shut down the Strait of Hormuz. Iran launched attacks on American bases throughout the Gulf. Iran fired missiles toward Israel. Iran deployed drones, cheap drones costing maybe $50,000, that crossed over American bases and destroyed helicopters worth tens of millions of dollars. And here is the mathematical reality that changes everything. America is firing interceptor missiles to stop Iranian drones and missiles. Those interceptors cost anywhere between $3 million and $10 million each. Meanwhile, the Iranian drones they are shooting at cost around $50,000. Do you understand the imbalance here? America is spending roughly 60 times more money defending itself than Iran is spending to attack. And Iran can manufacture drones faster than America can produce interceptors. This is not a normal fight anymore. America cannot simply spend its way to victory. In fact, the more money America spends, the faster it drains itself. And this has always been Iran's strategy. Iran was never trying to defeat America in one massive battle. Iran's goal is to slowly bleed America over time. Every dollar America spends that Iran does not have to spend becomes an Iranian victory. Every additional week this war drags on without regime change becomes another Iranian victory. Time is working for Iran. Time is weakening America. Now let's move to prediction number 1. Ground troops and hubris. This is really the central point of today's lecture. Now that you understand why predictions 1, 2, and 3 turned out to be correct, I want to explain what happens next. I have 3 new predictions, and I want to walk through each one carefully. My first new prediction is this: America will eventually send ground troops into Iran, and it will become the biggest strategic disaster in American history since Vietnam. Now, some of you may say, wait a second. If the air campaign is already failing, why would America escalate with ground troops? Wouldn't that only make the situation worse? Yes, it absolutely would make things worse. And that is exactly why they are going to do it. Here's what you need to understand about the American decision-making process right now. America entered this war with a single strategy: bomb Iran and force surrender. That strategy failed. So what happens next? If you are acting rationally, if you can step back and say, okay, this approach is not working, let's rethink this, then maybe you negotiate. Maybe you search for an exit. Maybe you cut your losses and walk away. But America cannot do that. And the reason is something called hubris. The American leadership cannot admit the plan failed. They cannot admit that Iran refused to surrender. They cannot publicly stand in front of the world and say, we made a mistake. This war is not going the way we expected. Maybe we need another path. They cannot say that. So instead, they double down. They escalate. They convince themselves that if the bombing campaign is failing, then the answer must be even more bombing. And when that still fails, the next step becomes obvious in their minds: send in ground troops. Now think carefully about what happens once ground troops enter Iran. America would not be invading a flat desert nation like Iraq in 2003. Iran is 4 times larger than Iraq. It is mountainous terrain. It has a population of roughly 90 million people. And the reality is this: Iran has not spent the last several years preparing for some symbolic confrontation. It has spent more than 20 years preparing for a war of survival. Since the early 2000s, Iranian military doctrine has been built around one central assumption: that eventually it could face a direct invasion led by the United States and backed by regional allies. Everything about Iran's strategy, its weapons programs, its underground infrastructure, and its regional partnerships has been shaped around that expectation. Unlike smaller countries that rely on conventional air superiority, Iran's strategy is asymmetric. Iran understands perfectly well that it cannot defeat the United States in a traditional open battlefield. So instead, it has created an environment where any invading force would become trapped inside a long, exhausting, multi-front conflict. Deep within Iran's mountains are networks of underground facilities, missile depots, command centers, and hardened military infrastructure built specifically to survive airstrikes and continue functioning during wartime. Many of these installations are deliberately hidden inside mountainous regions where satellite surveillance becomes less effective and bunker-penetrating weapons lose much of their advantage. Iranian military planners spent years studying the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Lebanon, and Syria, constantly adapting their defenses to counter the exact tactics America used in those conflicts. More importantly, Iran has invested heavily in systems and strategies designed specifically for mountain warfare. Anti-armor weapons, drone swarms, mobile missile launchers, electronic warfare systems, and ambush-based infantry tactics are all intended to exploit the weaknesses of American military doctrine. Helicopters, armored convoys, supply chains, and forward operating bases become extremely vulnerable in narrow mountain passages where mobility is limited and logistics lines stretch dangerously thin. In terrain like this, technological superiority does not automatically guarantee victory. The battlefield itself becomes a weapon. But perhaps the most dangerous part of such a conflict is that it would never remain limited to Iran alone. The moment American troops entered Iranian territory, the war could begin spreading across the entire region at the same time. Iran's regional alliance network was built precisely for this scenario. Groups aligned with Tehran in Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, and elsewhere would likely not remain passive while Iran fought alone. Instead, the conflict could expand outward in multiple directions simultaneously. American military bases across the Gulf region could suddenly come under pressure from missile attacks, drone strikes, sabotage operations, and growing political instability. Strategic locations in Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq could all become part of a much larger regional battlefield. Shipping lanes through the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz would immediately become vulnerable as well. Energy infrastructure could become direct targets. Oil exports could slow dramatically. And instead of confronting Iran through one clear front, the United States could suddenly find itself managing overlapping crises across a massive geographic region. This creates a deeply dangerous strategic possibility. Over time, the invading force slowly becomes the encircled force. Rather than America surrounding Iran, Iran and its regional allies could create conditions where American assets across the Middle East become isolated, overstretched, and increasingly difficult to maintain politically. Military strength alone cannot solve problems created by geography, logistics, and time. And Iran's leadership understands that very well. Now, the second major prediction is even more dangerous because it goes beyond the battlefield itself. It concerns the internal stability of the United States. Wars are not sustained through military power alone. They are sustained through political unity. And modern America is entering this potential conflict already deeply divided economically, socially, and politically. Public support for another large-scale Middle Eastern war is already limited. As casualties increase, economic pressure grows, and global instability spreads, domestic opposition would almost certainly intensify. Inflation, rising fuel prices, market volatility, and supply chain disruptions would begin affecting ordinary Americans directly. The consequences of war would no longer feel distant. People would begin feeling them in grocery stores, electricity bills, transportation costs, and growing uncertainty around employment. At the same time, the American political system is already under enormous strain. Congress struggles to consistently pass budgets. Political polarization dominates national discourse. Public trust in institutions continues eroding. Under those conditions, a prolonged regional war could become the trigger for a major internal political crisis. Iran's long-term strategy may not depend on defeating the United States in a conventional military sense. Instead, the objective could be to raise the economic and political costs of war to unbearable levels. If oil prices surge toward $150 or even $200 a barrel, the shockwaves would move through the global economy almost instantly. Transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, and energy markets would all feel the pressure. Food prices could rise sharply. Fertilizer shortages could disrupt agriculture. Financial markets could react violently to uncertainty and instability. And when ordinary citizens begin experiencing economic pain during an unpopular war, political systems often start fracturing from within. The conflict inside America would not necessarily appear as open-armed confrontation. More likely, it would emerge as institutional and political breakdown. Fierce struggles between factions demanding escalation and factions demanding withdrawal. Decision-making becomes slower, more emotional, and increasingly reactive. Strategic clarity disappears at the exact moment it is needed most. Historically, this is often how great powers weaken. Empires rarely collapse solely because of one battlefield defeat. More often, they become internally exhausted, financially drained, politically divided, and strategically overstretched. External wars expose fractures that were already quietly growing beneath the surface. Now, the third prediction is the most controversial and perhaps the most significant of all. It is the possibility that the current global order itself may be approaching a major transformation. Since the end of World War II, the international system has largely revolved around American dominance. The US dollar became the world's reserve currency. American naval power secured global trade routes. Institutions like the IMF and the World Bank helped organize the global financial system. This framework eventually became known as Pax Americana, the American-led international order. But no global system lasts forever. Every empire eventually faces the same question. Can it continue carrying the cost of maintaining global dominance? Critics of the current order argue that the system increasingly serves financial and geopolitical elites whose main objective is preserving global control structures rather than protecting national interests alone. In that interpretation, military power functions as the enforcement mechanism for a much larger financial architecture. Stability, trade routes, currency dominance, and market access all depend on overwhelming geopolitical force. And the concern emerging among many analysts today is that the American system may already be showing signs of exhaustion. Endless military interventions, rising national debt, political paralysis, declining public trust, and strategic overextension have all started raising serious questions about long-term sustainability. Wars become increasingly expensive. Public consensus grows weaker. And America's global rivals become more capable with each passing year. Within that environment, some observers argue that power centers around the world are beginning to search for new strategic anchors, states or alliances seen as more unified, more determined, and more willing to act decisively regardless of international criticism. Israel is often discussed within this framework because of its strong national cohesion during wartime, advanced military capabilities, intelligence infrastructure, and willingness to pursue long-term strategic objectives despite external pressure. From a purely strategic point of view, supporters of this theory argue that successful powers require three essential characteristics: unity, capacity, and determination. Unity means maintaining domestic support during prolonged crises. Capacity means possessing military and technological strength. Determination means sustaining strategic objectives even under heavy economic pressure or international criticism. And the argument is that many people increasingly view the United States as internally divided, while Israel projects an image of concentrated national resolve during periods of conflict. Whether one agrees with that interpretation or not, it reflects a much broader global debate about the future structure of international power. Ultimately, the deeper issue is not simply about one war or one specific region. The real question is whether the post-World War II global order can survive an era defined by rising multipolarity, economic instability, regional conflicts, and declining trust in traditional institutions. History shows that transitions between world orders are rarely peaceful or predictable. They are periods of uncertainty where old systems weaken long before new systems fully emerge. And that is precisely why many analysts increasingly see the Middle East not merely as a regional conflict zone, but as one of the major pressure points in a much larger transformation of global power.